Good evening, and welcome to a podcast in our series titled Past, Present, and Future: Perspectives on Mental Health in the Black Community. This initiative consists of a series of podcasts, forums, and healing circles over a 6-month period that seek to expose and counteract the negative stigma associated with mental health, encourage open and honest discussions among men, women, and youth, and provide tangible solutions towards healing and recovery. And for this podcast, we want to thank and show our appreciation to the City of Toronto for their support towards this worthy endeavor. Today, we're going to discuss a topic of critical importance for us as a people in the Black community. This podcast is titled Cultural Identity Formed from Colonialism and Neocolonialism: Traumatic Effects of Slavery and Racism on Black Mental Health. In this podcast, we will speak to and address how colonialism, neocolonialism, and racism as a socioeconomic structure has negatively affected the mental health of the Black Canadian community, including the African diaspora. We will also speak on the adverse effects of seeing the African Canadian community as a monolith, and how health determinants from factors such as migration, culture, colonialism, and neocolonialism, social, political, and socioeconomic systems lead to negative effects on Black mental health. I am your host, Richard Lambie, and it is a pleasure to welcome all of you to this very important discussion.
While the intention of this podcast is to create an environment of knowledge sharing, positive affirmation, and a space for joy, some content may be emotionally triggering and of a sensitive nature. This episode of the podcast features content related to issues of Black mental health, which may be emotionally triggering for some. If you or someone you know is triggered by this content, immediate support is accessible by calling 211. You can speak with a crisis worker at any time. You can also find support on our website at www.blacktothefutureto.com.
Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming two powerful individuals from the Black community. I am pleased to introduce Professor George J.S. Day of the Department of Social Justice Education at the University of Toronto, and Shireen Ashman, co-founder of C Center for Young Black Professionals. Professor Day is Ghanaian-born and is a renowned educator, researcher, and writer who is considered by many as one of Canada's foremost scholars on race and anti-racism studies. He is widely sought after for academic, research, and community work, whose professional and academic achievements have led to many Canadian and international speaking invitations in the US, Europe, and in Africa. Currently, he is Professor of Social Justice Education and Director of the Center for Integrative Anti-Racism Studies at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. Professor Day is the 2015, 2016, 2018, and 2019 Carnegie African Diasporan Fellow. In August of 2012, Professor Day also received the honorary title of Professor Extraordinaire from the Department of Inclusive Education from the University of South Africa. And in 2017, he was elected as Fellow of Royal Society of Canada, the most prestigious award for an academic scholar. He also received the 2016 Whitworth Award for Educational Research from the Canadian Education Association, awarded to the Canadian scholar whose research and scholarship have helped shape Canadian national educational policy and practice. He is the 2019 Paulo Freire Democratic Project Chapman University U.S. Social Justice Award winner. Last April 2021, Professor Day received the 2021 Lifetime Achievement Award from the Ontario Alliance of Black School Educators for his long-standing work promoting Black and minority youth education. Professor Day has 40 books and over 70 refereed journal articles to his credit. Finally, in June 2007, Professor Day was installed as a traditional chief in Ghana, specifically as the Jazaheni of the town of Asokori, Koforidua, in the new Juaben traditional area of Ghana. His stool name is Nana Aduse Sefa Tweneboa. That is a mouthful, to say the least. I'd also like to introduce Ms. Shireen Ashman. After surviving gun violence, Shireen honed her talents in social innovation. For over 15 years, she's created workforce, business, cultural, and educational programs to advance the socioeconomic standing of Black youth and community in Toronto and in the Caribbean. Called on for her expertise in ideation, strategy, and project management, Shireen has served in various roles in the nonprofit and educational space. Director of Operations, Program Manager, College Professor, Curriculum Developer, Trainer, and Consultant. She is the co-founder of the C Center for Young Black Professionals, a Black-led, Black-serving charity. And she co-founded the All Out campaign, and she is also a founding member of Sister Talk Toronto. As an educator, Shireen is practiced in experiential and transformative learning pedagogy. She creates and delivers immersive trainings related to trauma-informed care, experiential healing, community-based education, and nonprofit development. Shireen has presented at numerous conferences, educational institutions, and community organizations addressing frontline management and public officials. Today, Shireen is completing a master's degree in education with a minor in educational policy at OISE, University of Toronto. Additionally, she's earned a honors Bachelor of Arts degree in political science and a social service worker diploma. Another mouthful. And I want to welcome the both of you to this podcast.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's great to be here and to share the space with Professor Day.
It's great to have both of you. So I'd like to start with you, Shireen. When did you realize that your Black identity became a major component of who you are as a woman?
I mean, for me, that materialized when I moved to Canada. And I started actually engaging in the workforce. And one of my first jobs as a young person, I was called the N-word. And I remember bringing it to my manager, and nothing was done about it. And that really impacted me, really shocked me. It shocked me. But I've always been, subsequently, since moving here, really curious in exploring and wondering what's going on with the Black experience, Black youth condition specifically. Especially myself being a survivor of gun violence and the perpetrator being Black. And I just was, in my healing process, wondering why. So it was a culmination of all of those experiences where it became kind of front forward in my life and my purpose.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I just want to I think hearing Shireen speak about her life experience is very informative for me. And I think, but first of all, I think I would just want to acknowledge where we are, the land and also invite our ancestors and elders into this podcast and hear the conversation.
Absolutely.
But also to make a note about the fact that we are dealing with these discussions at difficult times, particularly when we hear what's happening in Buffalo, right? What has happened to our people, and how we need to come together as a community and deal with some of this racist violence that we have to do every day in our lives, and that. So I just want to show solidarity on that. But to come back to, I think, what Sharon was saying, I do associate with that. I think, to me, the question of Black identity became very, very pronounced for me when I came to North America. It doesn't mean that the concept of Black and Blackness was non-existent in Africa or where I grew up. I think, to me, we had a different conception of Blackness, which
exactly
was not which was not that conception, which is steeped in the Euro constructions of the good and the bad. So where white and Black are seen as a counterpoint of the other. I think when you look at African lexicon, right, the conception of Black spoke about resistance, spoke about joy, pride, and so forth. But the question of the Black identity is a consciousness that one gets into when you come to a very race-conscious society, where the color descriptor becomes so pronounced and powerful. So for me, although I would identify as an African, I also identify as a Black scholar, right? Because of the politics of that identity and what it means to engage in resistance in the face of all what we have to deal with as a people.
Join our inaugural focus group session on Wednesday, June 29th at 5 p.m. Make your voice heard. Tell us what you think. What do we as a community need to do to address Black mental health? What are we doing well? What needs to change? We want to hear from you. You know, you kind of brought up an interesting perspective, and I wanted to ask you, because the listening audience that we will be broadcasting this to may not quite understand, and I confess that I would not fully understand. What would be one of the key differences in your perception of being Black as in Africa, as opposed to what you were, what was shown to you, or what, you know, what was communicated to you coming here to Canada?
Yeah, I think in growing up in say in Ghana, right, Black symbolize things about rage, resistance, pride, joy, right? And those were attributes that people work with, right? So there are occasions when we say we need a Black cloth to wear to mark that occasion. When we are going to fight, right, we wear the Black cloth to show that this is all business. It's all about seriousness, right? Or when we have a funeral, we want to give the departed soul, right, a very fitting send-off. And so Black will symbolize that, right? That has nothing to do with questions of inferiority. It has nothing to do with the question of negativity that is associated with that concept when it comes to the North American context, right? So in that African sense, all these varying definitions of Black to me were very powerful, and they symbolize what we are. But we call ourselves Africans, right? But the point here there is that when you move into different spaces, right? I think, to me, Blackness, given that Blackness is also about resistance, right? It becomes very, very important to claim that because of the negativity that has been associated with Blackness. So you want to resist that. So we have to move between these spaces, and you talk about Black and Blackness in the different spaces, but with different meanings attached to them, right? And that is part of the coming to a consciousness of who one is. There's a saying in my Akan culture, right, that it's not what one is called that is most important. It's what one responds to that is most important, right? And I think, to me, this is again about what we do with the names that we take, what we do with the scriptures that are put on us, right? I think, to me, the question about claiming an identity is about resistance. It's about doing something with that identity. It's about bringing change to that identity. And those are very, very important, right, for us as a people, particularly when we live in a context where your blackness is seen as a marker for discrimination. Your blackness is seen as a marker for punishment, or where your blackness is seen as emblematic of inferiority. And I think we need to resist that, to claim a different sense of blackness, which is that, yes, we cannot talk about blackness in the Euro construction of blackness, but you talk about it in the African sense that brings that varying definitions and understandings
exactly
to that.
That's exactly so, because for me, what resonates is how it was constructed with me growing up. I'm from Jamaica, so Caribbean descent.
Right.
The construct was through resistance, empowerment.
Right. Yes.
And we learn about Nani and Paul Bogle, and it was of reverence versus coming into the North American context and the inferiority.
Yeah.
Implied, applied, explicit, implicit,
Yes.
And having to battle that in every moment, in every space, because it's so insidious, right? So many. I mean, Professor Day, I was over here snapping fingers like, yes, you were just dropping so many gems,
Yeah.
There's no question. This is, we've only been a few minutes in, and it's just so powerful. And what I can appreciate about this, me being of Jamaican ancestry as well, and learning about our heroes, the one that stands out to me the most is Marcus Garvey, because I felt that Marcus Garvey, and we can talk about Marcus Garvey and Kwame Nkrumah, the whole concept of Black Stars, and his influence with that, with the independence movement. But I can appreciate the fact that you have a perspective other than what we have experienced. And I think that's so powerful. And then I think when we look at the concept of community, we can benefit from you. So if we experience things similar, and I have as well, without question, similar to what Shireen had mentioned, out in the street, coming across someone like you and sharing your different perspective, I think is something that can benefit all of us who are from that side, who are from this side of the pond, if you will.
And you both make a very excellent point, and that is how we need to connect our Blackness and our Africanness, right? The two are intertwined, right? We cannot separate them, right? We cannot separate them. I think, to me, I always resist when people say, well, Black is a colonial term and I want to get rid of it. No, let's claim it, but let's redefine it in terms of what Shireen was saying about the resistance, right? That comes with it, right? So what we're doing is that our history is about resistance. It's about joy. It's about pleasure, but it's also about pain and the trauma, right? And we should embrace all that in a way that makes us human, right? And not simply be living lives that have been regulated and have been ordained or have been in many ways structured by whiteness and white supremacy.
Absolutely. This is so powerful. My next question, which I will apply to both of you, and Shireen, you can go first. How has the colonial mindset limited us and or empowered us through resistance? So you've just touched on this. It's as if you knew the question ahead of time to deal with mental health in our communities, because what we really want to look at here in this entire podcast series is how all of this has affected our mental health and therefore affecting our ability to move forward in life.
I mean, Professor Day with 40 books and 70, I mean, I feel that you are far more versed to begin the conversation. But for me, it's a very personal journey at the moment.
You're being
because
too humble, Ms. Ashman.
No, I
Okay,
can speak of it personally because I'm
please.
actually trying to apply that. I'm investigating it in my own life and my own leadership currently, right? So, I, I mean, we can all say, I don't know about folks, but 2020, 2021 was it was absolutely challenging, not only because of the pandemic, but with the passing of George Floyd, which was not, it was almost symbolic of enough, but it also challenged me. It challenged me in so many ways. It challenged my wellness and my well-being and how I looked at my life as an activist, as a form of, you know, giving back and building this community.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that for the most part, not all, but what I went to and looked to for wellness was very Eurocentric in its modality. And I went on this journey and is on this journey of trying to find my roots. And that led me, and it was my husband who said, Shireen, 69% of folks from Jamaica are from the Ashanti tribe. And so I went digging and looking for wellness in those spaces and came across the Gara and just some other folks and began exploring with more of elemental care because that's where our roots are, in the elements. And I can't tell you how much that has been a space of joy, spirituality, renewal, remembering for me as I've been exploring this over a year in my own lived, personal life. Right. So I can speak on it from that perspective. But Professor Day, I humbly come to you for knowledge.
we humbly defer to you, but I appreciate your response because I think our viewers also need to appreciate, as I appreciate, that it is a process and we don't have to stay where we are.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I know Sharon is being humble. Look, I think our lived experiences inform how we come to know about certain things, and I think it's so important for her to speak from that lived experience, the personal. Feminists always talk about the personal being political, right? Because I think it's through that personal experience that one becomes political and be able to engage that. So on this issue about the colonial mindset, right? A long time ago, right? Steve Biko, the African nationalists, right, talked about the most potent weapon of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed, right? And this is about that issue about that colonial mindset, how it is created. And then we know our own Bob Marley, right, Jamaica, right, in his songs, right, he talks about emancipate oneself from mental enslavement, right? None but ourselves can free our mind, right? That also speaks about that colonial mindset and how we need to get rid of that. And then the African feminist writer, women, talks about unchaining our minds, how we need to unchain. This idea of unchaining our minds speaks to the issue that one of our great former leaders, Jerry Rawlings of Ghana, said a long time ago, Africans were free. That's why Europeans needed chains to come for us, right? Now they don't need chains. They have our minds trapped. Fortunately, some of us are breaking free from that entrapment. Some of us are breaking free from, and this is what we need to do with that colonial mindset, right? One way is talk about communities, how we build communities, how we support each other, because the colonial mindset is about that divide and conquer, right? So we hear things about, well, nobody knows what a community means anymore. But a community, you create it. You build communities one step at a time. Nobody is going to hand it to you. We build it, right? Sometimes we hear this saying in the African language, it takes a village to raise a child. I don't think people really understand what that adage means. Of course, we need a collective to raise a child. What that adage really means is that you need to create that village in order to be able to raise a child. You cannot raise a child if you don't have that village. And that's the power of communities. Communities. And this is why, as a community, yes, our community is not homogeneous. Our community is heterogeneous, but it's a connected community. We need to connect our communities through race, gender, class, sexuality, right? And that's the whole thing about. So one of the colonial mindset is where we see ourselves as different, right? We see ourselves as different. And so, well, I'm African or I'm Ghanaian, I'm not Nigerian, and that. And we need to break that colonial mindset that, yes, there's power in claiming about being a Ghanaian, being a Jamaican, but there's also power in claiming our blacknesses and our Africannesses. And that's the essence of that breaking away from that colonial mindset, because it helps us deal with some of the issues, right? When we talk about, for example, racism, you can't talk about colonialism without talking about racism, right? And we know racism is a mental health crisis because it triggers chronic stress, anxiety, depression, and trauma, right? And we need to deal with this. How do we deal with this? We need to deal with this by building communities, by seeing ourselves as collectives, even notwithstanding our individualities. But there's a saying, look, the individual is important, but he or she is important insofar as they are connected to the community that they are part of. And sometimes we lose these African teachings, these African lessons, because we live in a society where we want to see ourselves simply as individuals. So somebody says, everything is me, 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 me. We don't want to talk about the community, right? You are very good in school, not because all the knowledge resides in your head as an individual. It's because you are in a community of learners and you share ideas. We are having a conversation. We have you, Richard, we have you, Shireen, and we have me, Nana. We are sharing ideas. At the end of the conversation, I'm going to be enriched by it because Shireen says something that I'm going to learn from. Richard, you say something that I'm going to learn from. And I say something that you both will also learn from. And we need to talk about this communities of learners, right? And this breaks away from that colonial mindset where we see ourselves as always in competition, always in hierarchies, who is up, who is down, right? Rather than see how we are connected. What are the relationships that connect us? What are the points of convergences, right? What are the points of mutuality, the mutual interdependence, right? You can't talk about Africa today without seeing that Africa is beyond a physical concept. Africa travels. There's Africa in Canada. There's Africa in Jamaica. Africa is not just on the continent, right? There's Africa in Latin America. And that is about the connections, making those connections. And we need to break away from this colonial mindset. And that's the whole thing that is so important, because when we don't break away from that, we only increase the stress, the anxiety, the depression, and the trauma. We are not able to deal with these issues, and they continue to reproduce and have damage on our psyche.
And be handed down from generation to generation to generation. You know?
Yes.
Absolutely. There is so much that you have introduced to the conversation. You looked at racism as a mental health crisis. I mean, that explains a lot very, very succinctly, and why, by seeing ourselves as together, that can help the issue. And then Shireen, you just made mention of how that therefore would then look at, would cause effects intergenerationally. So I really enjoy where we are right now, because there's just so many connections that are being made from this discussion. What I wanted to do is, just for the listener, for those who may not be so familiar, we've made a lot of references to the term colonialism and neocolonialism. And I wanted to ask you, Professor Day, if you could sort of help us to understand what those terms mean generally, and the mechanics, because I know this is something that you have studied. And when people are thinking of the terms colonialism, they may be thinking of something that's happened in the 1600s and the 1700s. But what does it absolutely, I think we all know this, but it takes forms in modern day society.
Yeah.
And
Right.
what would that look like for us today? And what are those mechanisms that we are still facing that, as you said, affect racism, which contributes to racism rather, affects our mental health, affects our ability to look at ourselves as a collective?
Right. Yeah. Well, look, to begin with, I think the whole question, to me, colonialism is not difficult to define, right? Because we do have many scholars who write about that, right? I think there are certain key things that are very, very important. It's a very violent process in the initial stages of occupation of lands, right? But it's not just occupation of land. Sometimes it's occupation of bodies and minds and spaces, right? Through this violence, right? When we look at colonialism in the formal sense, when we talk about an occupying force taking over these lands, minds, and bodies in order to determine the destiny of a people, right? But basically, at the end of it, it's a relations of power that we are talking about. It has been a tool not only to discipline bodies and souls, but also to steal lands and property and to dehumanize peoples, right? The anti-colonial theorist Amy Cizere talked about the fact that colonialism was no civilizing mission, right? It was barbaric, right? It was bloodthirsty. He talks about it being cannibalistic in terms of the effects of that, and devour anything along its path, right? But I think what is very, very important is that when we talk about colonialism, right, we have to connect colonialism with questions about racism, because these are not, I would say they're not unfortunate human errors or accidents. These things were intentional. They were planned and they have been executed through mental enslavement, right? I think it's very important for us to deal with this understanding that there are also material, intellectual, and spiritual havocs that have been wreaked by colonialism on the mind of the colonized that we need to break free away from, right? And this is very, very important for us to deal with. You see, one of the reasons why we need to talk about colonialism even today is because it has not ended. Sometimes people think, oh, colonialism was something that happened, 200, 300 years ago. No, it's still ongoing. And that's why there are scholars who talk about coloniality. It's an ongoing process. In other words, colonialism did not stop with the end of formal occupation because of the question of the mind, the bodies that I was speaking about, right? And I think it's very, very important for us to deal with that in terms of the present. And to give you a concrete example about, and Nkrumah talks about the concept of new colonialism, to give a concrete example. You see, the World Bank and the IMF, right? It has the power of ideas to determine who lives and who dies by its policies. And these policies are being implemented in communities, in villages, in the global south, whether it's in Africa, in Latin America, and so forth, right? And it's very, very important to see how colonialism has morphed into these new forms through ideas like imperialism, even through ideas of white supremacy. The surveillances that we see around us, how certain bodies are being surveilled, it's all through colonial processes, right? And we need to understand that because through the power of ideas, I have a friend, Andrew Coley, who told me, the World Bank is so powerful, not so much because of the money that it gives. It's the power of its ideas. It's presented as if it's the most correct thing to do. And that's what makes it so powerful, the power of its ideas. And these ideas are what we could call neo-colonial ways of dominating, of imposing certain values and practices on the people. And that's what I mean by they have become the arbiters of life and death in these communities. You asked a question about what are some of the mechanics, right? For me, I talk about the mechanics in let me just mention 5 ways that I will speak about the mechanics, right? When we look at it in terms of, even when we talk about what is science and what is excluded in definitions of science, right? So people's knowledge are seen as myths, mythologies, and other people's knowledges are seen as science. So there's Western science But in indigenous or African communities, we have superstitions. Well, we also have science. There are multiple sciences, and Western science is one of them. Then history. How history is used as a tool of colonization. What constitutes history? And how this history is taught to learners, right? Becomes an area to look at the mechanics of colonization, right? How history, when people talk about, let's look at, say, so there's a waterfall in Zimbabwe. And what is it called? It's called Victoria Falls. And you ask, why is it called Victoria Falls? They say, oh, well, there was a British explorer who came to this community and he discovered the falls. Give me a break. What about the local
people? Already there?
I mean, who are already there, right? This is how the mindset works, right? What about the people who took him there? So nothing ever existed until it was discovered by this white body, right? And this is something we have to deal with in that. And then when we look at even the whole issue of knowledge, right? The rules of reason, right? Well, you have to think in this way for it to be making sense, to make it, there are standards of logic and rationality. And when you look at what are those standards, they are the dominant standards. So Western knowledge systems masquerade as universal. It's everything, everybody has to follow that to make it logical. And then these colonial codes, I call something colonial codes, right? And the dichotomies, the distinction between nature and culture. In African communities, we don't distinguish between nature and culture. They're intertwined. Nature and culture are intertwined, right? Plants and animals have lives. It's not just human beings. Plants and animals have lives. And indigenous scholars like Leonard Simpson and others tell us that plants, animals, water, rocks, they have something to teach us that we can learn from. They have something to teach us that we can learn from, right? And that. So we have to break these colonial codes and the dichotomies, right? And last, in terms of the mechanics, right? To realize that we can't talk about anti-Black racism today without seeing how they are rooted in slavery and colonization, right? The denial of Black humanhood, right, are connected to enslavement and these processes of colonization, right? And let me end with the other part of your question, which is how have I developed my scholarship around this, right? I think to me, that race coloniality question, right, is something that we always have to take together, right? The colonial question is fundamentally a race question. And it has to be at the center of an anti-colonial struggle. We shouldn't shy away from it. We shouldn't never shy away from it. And my scholarship sees the connection between the race and coloniality because there's a tandem. Then the second, in terms of the way I work with my students, is around the multicentric knowledge, that there are different ways of reading the world, right? And we have to see how these multiple ways of reading the world becomes important to help us understand, right? Earlier when we talk about, look, Eocentricity is only one way of reading the world. There's also Afrocentric ways of reading the world, where you center the African learner into that. The same way indigenous scholars want to center indigenous ways of knowing, right? That's multicentric ways of reading our world. And as well, this multicentricity, what it does speak to is the fact that, yes, Africans can also think. Non-Europeans can also think. That knowledge is on the prerogative of only one group. And we have to challenge that. Then the third way in my scholarship is this, what I call the colonial appellation of indigenous, right? Africans have indigeneity. 1492 is not the beginning of the Black world. The world did not begin with Europe. Blackness did not start in 1492. So there's an African conception of the Blackness that we spoke about earlier, right? But it's also very important to talk about African indigeneity to understand African ways of knowing that predates Western systems of thought. And so we should be able to be proud and speak about African indigeneity and not only see indigeneity in a very narrow, limited sense. Of course, to talk about African indigeneity on Turtle Island, I have to recognize where I am. I'm speaking about it on Turtle Island. So, but that doesn't deny my African indigeneity and my African indigenous ways of knowing, right? Because knowledge resides in the body. And then the other ways to in terms of how it has engaged my scholarship is a redefinition of the colonial. That the colonial is more than something called foreign or alien. The colonial is also anything that is imposed and dominating. And this allows me to work with class, gender, sexuality as sides of colonizing experiences and bodies. So it's not just simply something which is foreign and alien, it's anything that is imposed and dominating. So it allows us to talk about the different tragedies of colonialism, right? We tell the story of colonialism pointing to the divergences and the convergences, right? The history of colonialism in Latin America is different from the history of colonialism, say, in the Caribbean and on the continent. But they are connected. They are very, very connected. So this allows us to speak about colonialism in the plural sense. To speak about colonialism in the plural sense, that allows us to look at the varied aspects of it and the variegated forms of that. But it also, I think to me, in my work, it allows me to speak about what actually Mbembe talks about, Black necropolitics, right? The question of about who lives and who dies, right? Because when we look at our life, right, the punishment, the surveillances, those carceral colonial projects of Black bodies, we are disciplined. We are put in spaces, in certain spaces, we are seen as transgression into those spaces, right? And therefore we need to be punished. Those are all colonial practices that we need to challenge. And this is why it's very, very important for us to see how our existence is about a tortured existence. In fact, Boniface Asante talks about how we have been magnetized by whiteness. And a number of us have been magnetized by whiteness. And I think we need to look at how colonization operates through that way, right? The Black body is seen, and I think many people talk about it, where the Black body becomes a perpetual slave. And we need to challenge this, that infantilism. We need to challenge that, right? And it's very, very important for us to be, and I think in my own work, I deal with this understanding. And lastly, in my own work, right, to work with a very critical understanding of decolonization. That is both about the land and it's also about the mind. Decolonization is about the land, but it's also about the mind, to be able to work this way. And I think we cannot engage colonization without bringing in a critical read of decolonization, which is about the body and the mind. And you see that the path to decolonization can be multiple, right? But for me, grounding our path to decolonization in Black and indigenous ontologies, ways of knowing, is very, very important. I always tell my students, when we have a practice called decolonization and you mainstream it, it loses its decolonization edge. You cannot seek legitimation from the dominant if your practice is decolonization. No, you can't. If something is truly decolonization, it cannot seek legitimacy and validation from the dominant. And this is why it's so important for us to think about how we engage this. And so in my work with my students, I engage all these conversations, right? Yes, settler decolonization is very, very important. And then decolonization is equally important. They are connected. One deals with fundamentally the question of the land. The other is also about the mind, and to take them together and work with them in that sense. And this is how I engage all these things. I know I've run on for too long, but I needed to get this out of my chest, right, on that.
Oh, no, sir.
Professor Day, I was just over here taking notes, like, okay, research this later.
Me too. So you think like me, Shireen. Absolutely. This was incredible. I was trying to, you've covered so many topics and it's just absolutely fascinating. So many things came out of this, but what I'm seeing here, because one of the things that is so important is the youth, right? The future, and how we can share the lessons and transform the minds. I think, well, I can speak for myself. I'm going to ask you as well, Shireen, but I know that when I spent a number of years living and working in Jamaica, doing community work, and for me, it was a sort of rite of passage because I felt like I was able to, using your terms, sort of start the process of decolonization. I studied Jamaica's history. I saw what happened with colonialism and what is still there today. You could see it physically. You could see it mentally. But you also saw indigenous practices from the Maroons. I met several Maroon chiefs, and they introduced me to certain practices. They introduced me to practices that they employed when they were at war. Certain things that they could use, certain plants that they could use to confuse and make ill their enemies when they were fighting. I mean, they were able to identify these things today, right? This isn't just folklore. So, I mean, you touched on so many of these things. So I found that when I came back to Canada, again, I have a long way to go. There's no question, but I think that I have begun to see things in a different light. And I think that light is more, and I really feel that Garvey helped me with this, in that when you look around you, different races and different cultures have contributed to everything that we see. It isn't just Europeans. I'm not going to say Europeans have not done anything, but colonialism, as you're saying, has left us thinking that they have done everything. And the more I look and see, the more I see that isn't the case. That, just every culture has made a contribution, but one culture tried to claim rights to it. What are your thoughts on this, Shireen? I mean, again, you spoke to the individual aspect of things, and I'm doing that now as well. How are you seeing things in this, let's say, decolonialization process?
I mean, for me, I've been largely focused on how do we not counterbalance, but shed light on, validate for ourselves our own contribution. So for me, my work has largely been around decolonized curriculum.
Yes.
And sharing that in a way that is fitting to today's context, so more experiential learning. Because my concern is, well, for example, one of my concerns is we're really losing sight and touch of even just our rituals. So how do we begin to share that, right? I've just recently began discovering again, Akan culture and what that means. And I'm just like, everything I can touch, I want to read, right? But that's my own curiosity. That's not to say the knowledge shouldn't be shared in a way that is more accessible for folks. Right. So that's kind of been my focus. How do we decolonize curriculum, share it in a way that youth finds it more accessible, and therefore keep the culture, keep the history, keep the tradition alive in this new modern context? How do we do that? That's kind of been my fascination.
It really, that's so powerful. And so you are literally concretizing how education is perceived and how you are sort of undoing what has been done in the past. I mean, that is so concrete.
Because here's the thing, there's an element of learning, but also unlearning.
Yeah.
So for example, One of the things and pieces of the curriculum at sea, let's bring it back to sea. One of the pieces in curriculum at sea that most of our youth speak highly of is the retreat when pre-pandemic. And why was that though? We brought them back to nature. We reintroduced them to the elements. We did a power story around fire. And folks just talked so much about how that has stayed with them. And also the sharing of their stories in that space, how healing that was, but also a remembering of, no, this is us. This has been us. You know, nature and to Dr. Day's point, being indigenous ourselves, reclaiming that, right? So it's looking at the ways that we can bring in our history in these practical lived ways.
Yeah, no, and look, I mean, you are both talking about the erasures, right? The colonial erasures. I mean, we talk about the colonial erasures in terms of our histories, but you also talk about the sense where sometimes what has happened is that we get into this zone where we sometimes there's that inferiority. We are made to feel inferior, right? When actually we are a people with a rich history who have made contributions that learners need to know, right? Learners need to know about these contributions that African peoples have made to world civilization, right? And that our history is not just about enslavement. It's not just about the journey across the Middle Passage. No, of course, people should know that. But should also know the rich history that takes us back, right? That takes us back. So when we talk about, say, African history, how do we teach African history in the curriculum? That speaks about the totality of our experience as a people, right? That talks about that totality of our experience as a people. And it's very important for us to be able to do this work in terms of decolonizing the school curriculum, right? Even how we teach about Blackness, right, needs to be decolonized, right?
Absolutely.
It needs to be decolonized. And I think this is an issue about what really needs to be done, because part of the project of learning about colonization is that it left scars, and deep wounds. And we need to heal. And that's one thing. The healing is very, very important. But part of that healing is also rewriting the narrative, right? We have to write back, as Linda Smith, and let's talk about, write back to that imperial and colonial narrative. And writing back means that we have to look at our indigenous ontologies, right? Go back to our indigeneity, go back to our indigenous world senses, as Oyewumi talks about, right? And reclaim that as part of making knowledge. We can think, we do create knowledge. We are not just consumers of knowledge. We also create and have created knowledge. And our students need to be taught that.
Absolutely. And, this, I suppose this wasn't an accident that the two of you were able to come together. Both of you are educators, and both of you are decolonizers. We look at the Black Panther movie, they called that person in there a colonizer. The two of you I'm calling decolonizers, and it's so empowering. The question I have for the both of you, the final question I have is, what advice can you give to the youth of today? We've touched on it in a few areas, in the struggle against racism and ongoing neo-colonialism today. And how do we ensure that the lens that we are seeing is not just restricted to stories of colonialism, neo-colonialism, and slavery?
I mean, I'll start because I need to take notes for Dr. Day to end. I think for me, it's a journey of self-discovery and social justice, right? And one requires an internal reflection and one an external activist. So, for me, it's teaching and sharing with my youth in a practical and lived way, because for me, leadership needs to be lived, not just spoken about. I need to demonstrate this. So showing how does that show up in my own life? Well, I'm doing this journey as we speak and talking about that with folks and sharing and being open, but also looking for avenues outside of that to make a stand as a collective to say, hey, this is a collective response as equity advocates, as folks are here championing social justice, because, equity for one means that all will benefit. That's how I see it, right? So I think it's an internal and an external reflection on all fronts, self-discovery, yes, but anywhere you kind of take your lens, whether you're looking at academics or even sports, if that's your thing, you're taking a look at, okay, what has been taught and expected of me, quote unquote, and what am I bringing through my showing up as my full self and my full Black identity plus, because it's intersectional, right?
Yeah.
So that's my take on it. But Professor Day, I'm starting to take notes right now.
No. I'm picking up on some of the ideas that you're saying. I think, let's start with the question about how do we ensure that the narrative moves beyond, say, slavery and colonization, right? I think one of the things we've both talked about is the question of that African indigeneity, that thing that there was a world before Europe. I think we need to talk. Our life is, colonialism may want to define us, as Alfred and Contasso talked about, but it cannot, because our life is so complex, and that's why we need to talk about the complexity of our life, right? And part of that complexity is talking about African indigeneity. Secondly, the whole question about how we have lived our lives, right? What can we learn from the way our communities have lived, right? It's not just simply saying, well, we want to go back to the past and take everything about the past. But there are certain lessons of the past, because the past is part of the present. And that present is also part of the future. So for us, we need to look at that, what indigenous scholars talk about, the spiral. It's not a linear, it's a spiral, it's a back and forth. The past, the present, and future. When I talk about African history, for example, I talk about the power of reclaiming the past, reflecting on the present, and projecting onto the future. That's a circle. So you reclaim the past, you reflect on the present, and you project onto the future. That's the way we talk about our history, right? It's a continuum. It's not like one has ended, the other is starting, right? Elena Sun talks about, even we live the present, we are living the present and the future now, right? Exactly. And then also to realize that we have rich intellectual traditions that we can talk about. Intellectual traditions in science, in culture, in literatures, arts, music, even the culinary traditions, our foods, the foods that we eat. You see how these things are connected, right? Through geographies, whether it's in the Caribbean, whether it's in Latin America or on the continent, the music. So these are things that we can talk about, right, in that. And that's part of ensuring that our life is not defined simply by colonization and enslavement. It's about the complexities of our life, right? And that, because one of the things about history, right, is that there's a linear construction of history that has been so problematic, right? A very linear construction of history, rather than look at history as a spiral, as something back forth, the past, present, and future being intertwined, right? I speak about that, and others also talk about that in terms of how we talk about Black futurity. Black futurity is about the past, the present, and the future joined together, right? We look at the lessons. We know the Sankofa, the Akan word Sankofa. We go back to the past, we claim what is useful in the present, but we don't want also, as Fanon talks about, to be imprisoned by the past. So we look at the past, the lessons of the past, and bring it to the present, and then project onto the future with it. That's the way our lives have been, right? So when you use that lens, you can see how we talk about resistance, how we talk about the joy, how we talk about the suffering, how we talk about the pain, but we also talk about the desires and our aspirations, and bring all of that into a dialogue. Now to the youth, right? The question of the youth. I want to highlight a couple of things here, and something we'll pick up from what Shereen was saying, right? Look, we have to empower ourselves. Nobody's going to empower us. We have to empower ourselves. And I think, to me, for example, I want our youth to form local chapters of Black Lives Matter. Local chapters of Black Lives Matter. And I talk about Black Lives Matter in a very generic sense because our lives have not mattered. And so we need that local chapters of Black Lives Matter where people will have the courage to speak out on the issues because Black Lives Matter. Students the youth will need to do their own research to understand our histories. Don't wait on the schools. They can fight to demand justice in their schools. That Black or African history is something that is all year round, not just in February, right? They can also use the media, the social media, in very creative ways to advocate for change that Shireen was speaking, the social justice work. Use the social media channels creatively to advocate for change, social justice work, right? When I talk about learning about our history, right? Youth can learn about the history of protests and ask questions about it. Why are people protesting even in 2022? Why are we still protesting? Why is police brutality a segment of the problem we have to deal with even today? What aspects of our society need to change? How can youth help organize and demand change? But I think the youth also have to acknowledge our own privileges because we speak from positions of privilege. And it's very important to acknowledge that because once you acknowledge your privilege, you then also acknowledge your responsibilities.
Right? What do you mean by privilege?
When I talk about privilege, it's the privilege of history, that we have a privilege of our ancestors who fought to make us what we are today. That's a privilege, right? But I'm not talking about privilege as a sense of entitlement. No, I'm talking about privilege that recognizes history, that if Shireen and Nana are speaking today, it's because others before them have created this platform on which they are speaking. That's a privilege. I'm speaking on that platform, right? And I think it's very, very important, right? It also means asking questions about the absences, the negations, and the omissions. We need to ask those questions. Nobody is going to ask those first. And we need to have honest conversations. The youth have to have honest conversations about race, about homophobia, about sexuality, about gender and transgender issues. Ask critical questions. And insist on having the right to know and ask questions. They should also hold our parents and our communities and our leaders and our governments accountable. As parents, our communities to be more involved. It doesn't mean they are not involved, but to be more involved and to be proactive. Of course, the building of communities is very, very important. We build communities, as I said earlier on. Communities are not hanging out in space. You plug them, you build them. So you build communities. Youth can build communities and be there for each other. Have each other's back. And youth can also take the individual as well as collective responsibilities that are required. Right? It's very, very important. And so I will end with some advice here, right? I think, to me, the youth is very important to know that resistance has been part of our history as African peoples. And so we need to develop the courage to speak out. Resistance has been part of our history. And so developing that courage to speak out is continuing that history. They also have to develop an awareness of what it means to be Black and what it means to be African. Do you understand what it means to be Black and what it means to be African in today's society? They must always search for brilliance, Black excellence. To me, that Black excellence is not just simply getting A+ on the test scores. It's also community responsibility. That is Black excellence. You can be good on the test scores, but you are very lousy when it comes to community work. That to me is not excellence. So yes, be good on the test scores, but also be very excellent in building communities. And never be afraid to design own futures and to make every moment a sea change. One thing about history, we've talked about history in all our conversations, we've been talking about it. History never forgets. It never forgives the past and injustice. History has a way to right wrongs. History has a way to right wrongs. And one of the lessons to me, anytime I talk with my students, I always talk about this idea that we live in societies where you could say a lot has happened, but not a lot has changed. A lot has happened, but not a lot has changed. And that's why we have a responsibility to always work for that change. We cannot afford to say, oh, I'm burnt out, or I have paid my dues. If you say you paid your dues, who did you pay it to? Can you tell us who you paid your dues to? Right? It's very important for us to see that change is not inevitable. We work for change. Change is not inevitable. We work for change. And that's why wherever we find ourselves, for the youth, wherever you find yourself, don't just be there. Don't just stand there. Take leadership roles. Be very Afrocentric. Be very collective in your thinking. Don't seek legitimation, validation, and acceptance in those colonial spaces. Seek legitimation, acceptance, and validation within your communities of work. And of course, we have to, one of the things, advance intersectional work, right? Because we are not just about race. We are also about class, we are about gender, we are about society, and be able to work with that. Because within this consumerist culture, we are always forgetting. We want to think of ourselves as just simply one thing, but we are more complex and complicated and be able to deal with that, right? Look, I think it's very important. We talk about the youth being the future. The youth can be very creative. And I think even the whole question of youth working with elders, listening with elders, talking with elders, helping each other is so important in building some of the things that Shireen and I have shared, right? It's so important. Of course, just because we are Black doesn't mean we are going to get everything right. We have to work at it. But we only betray our ancestors if we don't continue the struggle. We are only betraying our ancestors. They fought to make us have the voice that some of us have today. And we have a responsibility to continue that work. When elders are wrong, the youth must be bold to tell elders you're wrong. But the youth must also be prepared to listen. Because there's a saying in the African language or the African culture that where one stands has a lot to do with how far one can see. Where one stands has a lot to do with how far one can see. And for the elder will tell you, an African elder will tell you that what you stood on the chair to see, they sat down and saw it all. They sat down and saw it all. And I think it's very, very important for us to work with these teachings of our elders. That doesn't mean the elders are always right, but we need to have a way to engage in the dialogue, because elders bring wisdom, they bring knowledge, they bring the history of resistance that can inform the way forward for us as a people. And that's all I'll say for our youth.
That was incredible. I honestly don't have words to even encapsulate everything you just said. So I'm not going to attempt to. Is there anything else you'd like to say, Shireen, in closing?
Other than it's been a pleasure to share this space with you, Professor Day, and just to learn. Gratitude.
Absolutely. This has been incredible. We want people to comment on this podcast. Give us your thoughts. You know, post your thoughts on Black to the Future TO. We're on Instagram, we're on Twitter, we're on Facebook. Let us know what you think. You know, we have two educators here. The theme, it's just so telling. We came up with the concept of past, present, and future as a name for this podcast, and yet Professor Day has taken that and expanded on it so much. There's just so much that has come out of this. And Shireen, your contributions to this as well is just powerful, because you're, you know, if I was to compare the two, which that's not really what I'm trying to do. So Professor Day has arrived, but we are on the path, and you know, I can see from you, Shireen, that you are well on your way. And I really appreciate this discussion. And I personally feel like I have gained so much from this discussion, and I hope our listeners have too. This has just been, you know, incredible. Isn't justice to what we do here. So on behalf of everyone at C Center for Young Black Professionals and Black to the Future, I want to thank Professor Day. I want to thank Shireen Ashman for this discussion, for this conversation. It has been more than powerful, and we will sign off from now. So thanks to both of you. Join our inaugural focus group session on Wednesday, June 29th at 5 p.m. Make your voice heard. Tell us what you think. What do we as a community need to do to address Black mental health? What are we doing well? What needs to change? We want to hear from you.